Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis University. I'm John Levison, director of the Mandel Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this ongoing series of conversations with scholars of Jewish education. We created this series as a way to share scholarship in the field of Jewish education with a broad audience of educators and Jewish leaders. At the Mandel Center, we are committed to developing and promoting scholarship in Jewish education, especially scholarship on teaching and learning in Jewish education, in order to make a deep and lasting difference on the lives of learners and the vibrancy of the Jewish community. That's our mission. And today's session, and also our other events, help us to serve that mission by getting important ideas out into the world. We encourage you to take a look at the Mandel Center events page to see the rest of our upcoming events. We're delighted to have so many folks joining us live, and we hope to be able to take some of your questions as we go. So please feel free to post those questions. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And we're also recording today's session, and we'll make the recording available afterwards on the website for those who couldn't join us today. But the recording will only capture the presenters and not the audience. Now, our guest today is my colleague, Judah Cohen. Judah is the Lou and Sybil Mervis Professor of Jewish Culture and also Professor of Music at Indiana University, where he also served until just recently as the director of the Jewish Studies program there. And now he also serves as an Associate Vice Provost for Academic Affairs. Much of Judah's scholarship focuses on Jewish music and the people who make Jewish music. And today we're going to be talking about an article that he recently published in the Journal of Jewish Education that was titled Musical Alternatives, Debbie Friedman in Houston, 1978 to 1984. Judah, welcome. It's good to see you.
Oh, thank you, John. It's so good to be here. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Great. So as I just mentioned, we want to talk about your recently published article about Debbie Friedman in the late 1970s and early 1980s. But let's start with the backstory for this research. How did you decide that you wanted to study Debbie Friedman? And then tell us a little bit about your methodology as a musicologist, as an historian. What does your research process look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in some ways, I'd start by saying that Debbie Friedman kind of serves as the center of a lot of my work. Whether it is looking at 21st century Jewish music or looking at music in Jewish life during the 19th century. My background is one that includes a number of different experiences throughout the Jewish world and throughout the Jewish institutional world. So I grew up in a in an East Coast, New Jersey conservative synagogue and had very good relationships with the cantor there as well as cantors in the area, trained with them. I also had the opportunity to go to the CAJE conference as well, starting for me at the age of 7, where I had an opportunity to get to see an enormous range of not just amazing educators, but fantastic musicians and fantastic song leaders and Jewish music specialists as well. Of course, this kind of broader picture was one that also led me to other aspects of Jewish education and Jewish music. I was involved in a Jewish a cappella group, helped to start one when I was an undergraduate. And all of these things led me to start asking all kinds of interesting questions about what it means even to think about Jewish music. Where does Debbie Friedman work in all of this? Well, it so happens that while I was trying to come and figure out my dissertation work or to try and figure out what my major project was going to be, I re-encountered this interesting tension that existed in the United States between different ideas of what Jewish music represented and what was appropriate in a synagogue setting or in other kinds of Jewish religious settings, such as summer camps or informal settings, as they're sometimes described now. And that is really the thing that led me to start asking the really interesting questions, or at least the questions that to me have generated much of the rest of my work since, which is how do people define their connection with a kind of Jewish sonic tradition, and how did they define what they see as not part of that tradition? Those two things really ended up becoming the kind of basis of my dissertation work, which was looking at the ways that different Jewish music discourses take place in, for example, the Debbie Friedman School of Sacred Music. Back when I was researching it, it was just the School of Sacred Music in New York, at Jewish summer camps, and also in synagogues, and began to see that there was all of this really interesting conversation. At the center of it all, often, was this, what was sometimes described as a gap between music that was associated with, let's say, Jewish tradition going into Europe, and music associated with song leaders. And often Debbie Friedman became the kind of name that was the reference there. She was really so central to the idea of how song leaders did what they did. And she herself also was, of course, not just a force of nature, but also a major figure in training and maintaining a high level of song leader training, and a kind of deep integrity as to what it means to be a song leader. So that ended up going in one direction, and then, but nonetheless, I started to think very carefully about what it might mean then to look at Debbie Friedman herself. I had met her several times. I had, of course, been inspired by her music as well as, or as part of my broader musical training. And yet at the same time, it seemed that there was so much conversation about the things that she musically had, or the things that she musically didn't have, and the ways that that related to what it meant to think about synagogue music. So I figured at some point that it would be really important to look not just at Debbie Friedman and her music, but also to try and follow her career moving forward, rather than go backward and think about how we think about her today. Yeah. Moving forward that way really is what led me into the area that led to this essay, and of course, a much larger project trying to understand her life, career, and music. Yeah. In terms of my methods, I'm trained as a musicologist. I'm also trained as an ethnographer. And so in a sense, part of the fun of doing this kind of research, and part of the excitement of doing this research, was trying to look for not just what it meant for ideas to develop as a process, how to see different drafts, for example, of particular musical ideas, or of particular liturgical ideas. And I see Debbie Friedman as a liturgist, but also to try and find those things in places that perhaps might not be the main sources of information that we sometimes look at today, be they books or encyclopedias or other areas. So for me, a lot of this was going into a lot of archives. Yep. I'm trying to go into, for example, the archives of Bolensang Ruby Union Institute, which were just being established around the turn of the, around the end of the 20th century, turn of the 21st century, to try and look at things like song sheets. Right. Or to try and go through what are sometimes described as ephemera, things that are used maybe for one or two uses, and then are often seen as at least disposable. Hopefully, they're not disposed of. Similarly, going to synagogue newsletters was another area that I would go to, right. And likewise going in other areas too. In addition to that,
so for example, one of the things you do in the paper is you dive into programs of CAJE, and you tackle some of that. So I wanna if you could try and sort of encapsulate the arguments at the 30,000 foot level. What do you want people to know about Debbie Friedman from this article?
A couple of key things. The first thing I want to point out is that Debbie Friedman is not someone who just wrote a few songs. Debbie Friedman is someone who had a very significant philosophy, a very deep commitment, not just to Judaism, but also to Jewish leadership and figuring out where Judaism should go, and especially liberal Judaism at the time. And also, another key thing is to recognize all of the major changes that were taking place in Jewish education, and also in the development of what I would consider to be, anyway, what it meant to consider music in synagogues at the time as well. That all of this was really in significant development and change, and that Debbie Friedman was someone who was trying to navigate that at a time when norms were shifting, and shifting in very key ways. So that's the kind of difference.
Yeah, and it's such a fascinating period to think about the late 70s and early 80s, and you really display in the article the disagreements that are going on, the tension about what kind of art and music is appropriate, especially in a synagogue setting.
Mhm.
And I was so intrigued to see not just a question of aesthetics,
Mhm.
but I mean, you just mentioned philosophy, right? There are real ideological questions here about constancy and tradition and change.
Mhm.
And then there are also questions about professionalism,
Yes.
right? Who is a professional cantor, professional musician, professional educator? And I also think there's some questions here about class and about gender that also get played out. So help us understand this.
Okay, yeah, there are many different things that are kind of happening all at the same time here. One of the key things, and we can talk about it in terms of professionalism, that there were certain kinds of ideas associated with prestige, perhaps, or what it meant to be able to present music in the synagogue. And here what we have are really a wide range of practices, but one that we can really look at very closely is the cantorate. What we think of often as the cantorate is this kind of long constant of synagogue music leadership. In some ways, opens up a somewhat different picture here, in that the cantorate and the School of Sacred Music and other institutions of Jewish sacred music are at this point kind of struggling. They're trying to find ways to expand out from the East Coast, for example, and trying to figure out the best way to be able to promote the particular philosophies of Jewish music and Jewish music tradition that let's say, the School of Sacred Music's training program really was all about. It was as much about really trying to find its own legitimacy at the time as well, what it means to stand alongside rabbis. For example, and how to be able to promote an idea of co-clergy rather than looking at a rabbi and cantor as being on separate levels, which is one thing, and thus representing the idea that Jewish music needs to have the same legacy as Jewish text and Jewish philosophy. From another side, there is the shift that's taking place in terms of women coming in to professional spaces. They've always been in professional spaces, but in particular, when it comes to synagogue leadership and Jewish religious leadership as well. Remember, the 1970s was a time when women were just beginning to become accepted into rabbinical programs first, and then cantorial programs, which becomes interesting as well. There's a 4-year difference, for example, at Hebrew Union College when it comes to that. And similarly, in terms of what it means to then become a part of the cantorial organizations that people go into after that. So that's another part. The idea as well of what it means to make specific lifestyle choices. There were certain kinds of things such as a college degree or as being part of a marriage that would also elevate people's status within Jewish leadership. So those are some of the key areas.
I mean, it's so helpful to kind of, as I was reading, for you to bring us back to this moment. She's, as you said, she doesn't have a college degree. She's married briefly and then divorced. Is that right?
Yes.
And so she doesn't present as what the community may be conditioned to expect from its leadership. So she's looking very different, and she's a fairly young woman at this in this stage.
Right. She's approaching 30 at this point.
And so tell us a little bit more about her own growth and development. This is a particular slice of her life. You're interested in other aspects, and you've written about it, and you're continuing to write about other aspects of her life. But in this period, tell us what's going on for her own growth and development.
Yeah, it's a really good moment. So she's coming from St. Paul and then from Chicago, places where she had really been given opportunities to work within synagogues. That is, often we associate her with summer camps, but in fact, she was very much involved in synagogue music making. And in Chicago, for example, had been a commissioned composer, a composer in residence for Chicago Sinai. At the time. So she saw herself and other musicians around her saw her as well as a consummate professional who was connected to a number of different kind of key institutions, both Jewish and musical institutions. Now she comes down to Houston and she follows the rabbi at Chicago Sinai, Samuel Karff, who then goes down to Houston. And then at that point, she finds herself in a kind of an interesting place where, essentially the idea of what is prestigious within the Jewish leadership world begins to start relegating her into Jewish education instead. So there she, of course, does what she has been doing up until this time, which is finding existing rituals and then reinventing those rituals so that they have relevance for the populations that she's working with, and doing so at a level of very high polish, I would add. So while she does, for example, what you might consider to be school pageants, for example, for let's say for Purim and for Hanukkah, she really works with these kids so that suddenly you have these 3rd through 5th graders who are singing these incredibly complicated arrangements and doing so, again, at a very high level. Again, the issue here, though, is where she is perceived in when it comes to prestige. She is not married. She's single. She is trying to, again, promote her own musical career. And whereas she's accepted by local studio musicians, she is not accepted in the same way by local synagogues.
Mm-hmm. So one of the fascinating, I don't know, historical coincidences, I don't know if it's in fact a coincidence, but it happens coincidentally, is the emergence of CAJE. And you write, you in one line, you say that Friedman and CAJE grew together. So give us a little bit of background on this. What was CAJE trying to do? And what do you mean by the fact that CAJE and Debbie Friedman grew together?
So part of what I've been doing throughout this work is to sort of start by saying, here's how we encounter a reality or a present day. And how did we get to that point? And often the way we get to that point is very different. So I encountered CAJE at the age of 7 as a place that not only had the greatest of Jewish educators there and the greatest enthusiasm, and also the idea and this very significant idea of professionalizing Jewish education as being seen by younger and really dynamic generations, but also as a place where the center of, at least as I was looking at it, the center of the Jewish musical world was. You get together on Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night, and especially Wednesday night. Especially Wednesday night, when everybody would be getting together, and it would be a deeply religious experience, as far as I was concerned, singing together, often with Debbie Friedman as one of the key figures. We also had Kol Beseder, we also had Beged Kefet, we had many others, the Farbrengen Fiddlers, and so on and so forth. But Debbie Friedman, it turns out, was one of the key people to bring together a group of people that were working so hard to be able to professionalize Jewish education and to be able to get it on the agenda of the Jewish communal world, as they famously did. But at the same time, early on, they seemed also to be a very highly intellectual group, and a group that was particularly involved in, of course, establishing their bona fides by showing their intellectual, by showing their intellectual depth. Yeah. Music was something that needed to come in and be a part of that. And over the course of time, it started with this kind of what I would say is a kind of a gingerly dance between, can music continue to maintain, can music be added, and can CAJE continue to maintain its intellectual integrity? Yep. And Debbie Friedman was right at the center of that moment, where it seemed that the CAJE leadership decided that, in fact, not only could music be a part of that deep integrity, but it could also help to lead and to unify the community of educators.
Yeah, this is just another fascinating aspect of the article. You write about how at the very outset of CAJE, so in the late 1970s, they're thinking about music as entertainment. And then they start to realize, wait a second, there's more going, this is obviously my paraphrase, there's more going on here than let's entertain these hardworking educators. The Jewish liturgical music, the new compositions, this is actually a kind of Jewish education. It's a location for Jewish education. There's real expertise here. We can participate in this. We can learn from this. I have in mind the conference that we ran here at the Mandel Center in the spring on art and artistry as Jewish education, where part of the agenda was to say, it is not simply the case that somehow art is a vehicle through which Jewish education passes, or and certainly not just an opportunity for entertainment, but in fact it is a mode of Jewish education itself. And that's just fascinating to see. As you said, these were folks who were desperate for education to be taken seriously, taken seriously by the community, and really they were activists. They weren't just they weren't just going on a retreat together. And they had to really develop a new sense about what the role of Jewish music could be for that. And as you said, it became a hallmark of CAJE.
Yes.
That Jewish music was really at the center of it.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And I mean, this isn't to say that there wasn't that music hadn't already been a key part of Jewish education up until this point, but it was that Debbie Friedman provided, and I know we mentioned this in the title here, a kind of a soundtrack for CAJE, a reinvention, one that, up until that point, Jewish music was seen also as one that you needed to be musically trained, musically literate. You needed to connect to hundreds of years of tradition, and popular music was something that certainly was going to cheapen Jewish education. Shift that around so that with CAJE, this kind of deep engagement with music was no longer really seen as popular music, but rather instead became a music of the people, which I think was a key difference.
So that's a great segue. I want to introduce one of the questions from our audience about a distinction between song and what the questioner says, other aspects of the synagogue soundscape. So we have music that accompanies liturgy. We have liturgical music, and then we have some things that are imagined as outside. And we also maybe have some blurry lines there. How do you think about that?
Yeah, well, part of the thing that in some ways that this led me to as well is a kind of a much broader picture as to how we look at Jewish music overall and music in the synagogue. In fact, a lot of the stuff that we see today as being somehow connected to a deeper tradition was, if you look in the 19th century, pop music. Just bluntly, pop music. There were, how would I say it? There were amateur choirs everywhere. In fact, part of the fun, some of the fun stuff that I was looking at essentially looked at the idea of communal singing as the basis for liberal liturgy, or liturgy more generally, not just Jewish, but everywhere else, all around the same time. Isaac Mayer Wise, going back into the 19th century, was himself involved in what were known as choral festivals, or choral festivals where 30,000 people would get together. Today it's called the May Festival, I believe, in Cincinnati. And they would all have their little, their communal choral groups that would be all singing together, for example. And to give you a sense of how important that was, when Isaac Mayer Wise was introducing Minhag America in 1857, they had to delay the introduction so that the congregation and the choirs involved could all make the music sound better. So music and liturgy and approaches to popular music, even though we don't see it today, are so central to everything that's involved in what we now see as synagogue music.
Right. And when I think about, that this is obviously not my field, but just from my own exposure to Debbie Friedman's music, I think about examples of that feel more like this is new music for old liturgy, and sort of reviving old liturgy with new music, and then also some pretty significant influence of new liturgy, right? Introducing new ideas, new words, new concepts in the vernacular, typically into then what becomes known, familiarly as the synagogue setting.
Yeah, and you could go one step further. I mean, to think about the 1970s and into the 80s, which we also didn't talk about, but could spend another half hour on, was a time of liturgical renewal in the Reform movement, and of course, lots of discussion in the conservative movement as well. That's the time when Gates of Prayer starts to come out, starting in the 1970s, and Debbie Friedman is right there at the premiere of Gates of Prayer, where you have all of this new material. And she herself was also a liturgical seeker as well. She may not have graduated college, but she certainly attended the Spertus Institute or Spertus College at the time, and she studied there as well with a couple of key liturgists. So, part of what becomes important here is to say that, yes, we have this renewal of liturgy that is taking place simultaneously, and she is there and being accepted as a key voice of that new liturgy.
So the article that we're talking about addresses this particular period, this period in Houston to 84. Give us a sense of the sequel. What happens from the 1980s on? A little bit of a preview.
So from the 1980s on, one of the things that I tried to follow here, she moves over to Southern California. And in Southern California, in a place where there isn't necessarily the same kind of, or at least there isn't entirely the same kind of hierarchical structure associated with synagogue leadership, she then gains a position as first, I believe the term is ritual leader or musical leader, or occasionally cantor, or Hazan at a new synagogue over there, while connecting with a kind of a bigger group of people there as well, and becoming involved in other kinds of new initiatives. And one of the things that I see throughout Debbie Friedman's life is that she starts to really connect with, or becomes the voice of, an increasing number of new initiatives. So she moves over to Southern California for a number of years, and there she also is able to reinvent many different things, including new rituals such as the Simchat Chokhmah ceremony. That is the ceremony that's associated with women turning the age of 60. She becomes involved in women's involved in women's religious leadership groups. As well as LGBT groups. Also, we start to then move our way forward into other areas as well, such as Mayan and the first women's Seder. For example, the first Mayan Seder in the early 90s when she moves into New York. And she continues to become really a voice, again, of new initiatives and new ideas in American Jewish life, as she had before, but as she continues to become really a senior figure in that, and then a leader among other, for other song leaders, but also for other religious groups, religious leaders as well.
Yeah, and when I talk to students today, they're I'm thinking about students, for example, who attended Jewish summer camps. Mm-hmm. Their lives, sometimes they know, sometimes they don't know, is really their picture of Jewish music is really very well informed by Debbie Friedman. They don't know a time when there wasn't Debbie Friedman, when these things didn't exist, but this has now become the standard repertoire in so many Jewish educational settings.
Yeah, it's become absolutely central. And again, part of it is to understand that it's not just the repertoire, but it's also the big ideas, the big services that she was trying to really think about and to be able to connect to contemporary life, but also what it meant for her as a woman to have to negotiate these changing structures of leadership, some of which allowed her in, but many of which did not allow her in at the particular times when she was ready to enter, and the route that she eventually created for herself, and with allies and with these new initiatives that led her and helped her to really develop a career that we now see today as quite legendary.
Right. So we have time for just one question. I want to ask you, Judah, what do you think Jewish educators should learn from this particular moment in time? What lessons are relevant? Why should this matter?
It's a really good question, and one of the reasons why I submitted this particular essay to the Journal of Jewish Education. Part of it is to say that music does not come automatically to Jewish education. Rather, instead, music is a crucial part of Jewish education, and in doing so, it's important to see how it comes in to Jewish education, that we see now or can learn in much greater detail the kind of institutional stakes that are involved, but similarly the significance of giving the idea of trying to become a Jewish educator and trying to be able to transmit materials and be able to transmit ideas of Judaism, how important a soundtrack is to that and how deeply integrated it is. That to me is really kind of one of the central messages that I want to present here, and how in some ways we're talking about more than just text. We're talking about the ability for many multimodal, multi-mediated forms of education, how they all contribute to a key, they all contribute to the major values that Jewish education represents.
Right. Thank you, Judah. It's great to talk with you about your work. I want to thank everyone for for joining us this afternoon. I encourage you to check out the Mandel Center events page to learn about our other upcoming events and videos of our prior events. Our next session in this series, Learning About Learning, will be on December 7. I will be speaking with my colleague here at Brandeis, Professor Ziva Hassenfeld, about why Jewish day schools should teach students to read Torah. Thank you again, Judah. Thank you all for joining us. Take care.
Thank you so much, John. It's such a pleasure.